Hey everybody, welcome to the Oregon State University Permaculture Design Pro class. We are the Winter Spring 2024 class. We are on session 4 for our office hours, and we got some great questions starting us off for our office hours. But before we begin, I'm just curious, how's everybody's course going? A little bit of an update into the chat, or if you want to unmute and chat or raise your hand, all are good. How's the course been? How's the material? How are the assignments? How's the education? How's your learning going? Is there any knowledge gaps? Where you at?
I'll talk. I think it's going fine. It's going well. I'm chiming in here because I was interested in Erica's questions about some of the mistakes that people made. So I wanted to tune in to see what that was all about. So
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Appreciate it. How about for everybody else? How's the course going? Chana, it's been superb. Lovely. I like that. Awesome. Guest guide, I like it. It is methodical. I like how it looks at the same thing over and over again from different angles. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I've been such a big proponent of the SWOT analysis and why I think some students get frustrated because redundancy is not a bad word in permaculture or in ecological systems. Redundancy functions in such a beautiful way so that way you always have a separate connection. And while we don't formally teach ecology in this course, ecology is central to making sure that the design works and works well. So I appreciate that. Anybody else want to chime in? How's the course been? Pros, cons, challenges, quotes, quotations? JRQ, really good. I can see that there's a lot I don't know. I can see this being a lifelong learning opportunity. Yeah, I hear you. I had the opportunity to do 2 presentations last week, 2 weeks. One was for the Permaculture Institute of North America about developing business, and then a wildfire design preparation conversation. And then the other was for OSU. It was all about my journey into permaculture. And that's something I really got in when I took my PDC in 2009. I remember writing in my journal that day that this could be something I dive into and learn about for the rest of my life because it's an ethic, it's a way of being that permeates through other applications. Larry Santoyo, who was a former special police officer in LA, has this great saying, which is, you don't do permaculture, you use permaculture in what you do. And so while there is this conversation of being a quote unquote permaculture designer, and I think most of you know how I feel about that, it is an application that when you apply yourself in a way that has the ethics behind it and the prime directive, you fundamentally change the way you approach a conversation. And then with that comes the conversation of, don't be so indebted into permaculture that you lose the forest for the trees, because there's lots of great tools and practices and principles and other aspects out there. So great. All right, everybody. Well, thanks so much for chiming in. I appreciate that. So one of our, right, that was the first thing I was going to talk about. So we've got a great webinar coming up. If you aren't familiar with low-tech erosion controls, I would highly recommend checking out this webinar coming up. This will be on Thursday coming up here, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard, and then the other time zones as it is. Neil and Jeff have been working on low-tech erosion control, working to stop erosion for a couple of decades now. It'll be a phenomenal webinar. If you can't make it during the time, definitely sign up. You'll get the replay afterwards. But great webinar. And there's also a chance to win the self-paced version of the course for those that are on the webinar on Thursday. So that might be a reason to connect. So we have
Jeff, a quick question about that webinar.
Yeah.
Do you know, so as you know, my site has virtually no surface water, but we have a creek that has shaped the geology. So the erosion I'm concerned about is the creek bank, the opposite bank of which is the railroad side, which is being covered with riprap for decades. So the only place to erode is our side of the creek. So do they deal with like constant flows of powerful water, or are they looking more at like surface flows that cut through rainstorms and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the majority of what they do is surface flow during what we'd call saturated soil flood.
Okay.
They do go into riprap around flowing water, but I still think, something like David Polster's work and
Mhm.
that book would probably be the best place for you
Yeah,
to start.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. If I was still closer, it'd be fun to actually run a workshop on it and do an entire
Uh,
planting there. That'd be a phenomenal opportunity. You guys have such a great spot to do that.
yeah, yeah.
The other thing I'll say here, and I'll just pull it up, is the self-paced course landing page has a number of really brilliant case studies that Neil and Jeff went over a few years ago when we designed it. I'll just put it in the chat here. And then I'll share my screen and I'll walk you down through it. So if you're keen to kind of see what some of that conversation would be like, right at the bottom of the page here, it's all of these great case studies where they show the conversation. They did a bunch of drawings in Zoom with me. And it was a great conversation that really showcased what low-tech erosion control can do. I'm just going to quickly look through these and see if there's anything specific. I think vertical fish scale straw mulch would be something to take a look into for you, Ruben, only because it's super cheap, doesn't cost a whole lot, doesn't take a whole lot. And on some of those steeper sections coming from sort of the northwest, kind of where we thought the pond might go and coming down onto the flats, this might be a great way to actually stop and slow and start to revegetate some of those drier spots. Yeah, I think that was the one I wanted to check into. Okay. Good question. All right, so Chana's amazing question, and spoiler alert, I'm researching this right now, and I'm in contact with a gentleman in northern India who's had a lot of good success dealing with elephants. So this is a beginning conversation, not an ending conversation. So human elephant conflict in Sri Lanka. Every year, around 200 lives are lost and 300 elephants perish in the struggle in Sri Lanka and Polonnaruwa. That's my take on it. Has the highest casualties. My 60-acre farm exemplifies the hardship firsthand. 8 guards struggle nightly against electrified fences breached by desperate elephants. They devour mangoes, other fruits and vegetables, and rampage during the season and simply migrate through during lean times. Adding fuel to the fire, recent government approvals allow 2,500 hectares of nearby elephant grassland to be converted to farmland. This displaced them, pushing them towards villages and farms like mine, fueled by fear and hunger. Guns and crackers escalate the tension, creating anger, distress, and distressed animals. However, I seek a solution beyond conflict. I envision an elephant corridor within my 60-hectare farm, offering safe passage while protecting my crops. Moreover, I'm proposing to dedicate 10% of my yield to wild animals, fostering coexistence. But concerns remain. Does this attract more animals, worsen the problem? If so, the feasibility of achieving the preliminary requirements for Zone 5 might be impacted, would it not? An increase in wildlife threats could impact the feasibility of achieving the preliminary requirements for Zone 5. And 2, are there any successful examples of elephant corridors within farms or similar initiatives being implemented in other countries or regions with human-elephant conflict? I'm eager to see what we can do to find a harmonious balance for humans and elephants to thrive. Thank you very much, Chana. Amazing question. Stupendous. I've had very little experience with elephants, only one design situation where I did exactly what I'm doing now, which is basically I usually conduct sort of thick and thin interviews of folks who've worked at this until I find the person who's worked at it long enough to find a good solution. And so what I've found as I've been posting to some of the groups I'm with, and the Regrarians.org has an amazing platform called the Regrarian Workplace. And if working at scale, and Chana, I would say at 60 hectares, you are, it may be the next step if you want to go further into design. The Regrarians platform functions on PA Yeoman's scale of permanence for all things agricultural. And I took the training in 2013, maybe 14, and just revolutionized my approach because I started in permaculture, knew I wanted to go broadacre, and permaculture peters out when you start getting to larger scale applications. And I only say that because the ethics still work, the approach still works, the design approach still works, but it's sadly lacking in functional examples outside of anecdote that have quite a bit of mileage on them. So while permaculture talks about agroforestry, and it's definitely a part of permaculture, within the permaculture materials that were created by Bill Mollison, and call it the folks in the core conversation afterwards, they were always using it as sort of ancillary aspects to bring in. You really have to find people who are dedicated to those aspects. Same thing with syntropic agroforestry and the rest of them. So if you are wanting to scale up and work at scale, I think that would probably be a great training for you. That's Darren Doherty, and he runs an online Rex training usually once or twice a year. Although I just found out he took on a monster project in India, and so that might be changing. So we have somebody else who's in Sri Lanka, which is really interesting on one of my my feeds here. I'll just read it out for everybody because I see some people reaching in. So this is from Azam. The elephant-human conflict, HEC, here in Sri Lanka is a growing problem. There are several factors that contribute to this, and as a sustainable solution, the majority of these would have to be addressed. In addition to government policy decisions that usually have two logical grounds, like clearing up grasslands and forest reserves for various development projects, the people also have resorted to hostile approach, e.g., shooting, makeshift shotguns, electrocution, mains voltage 230 volt, which is illegal but widely practiced, and use of fireworks as deterrents. The most inhumane device is the jaw bomb, which is an explosive wrapped up in food and usually blows the elephant's mouth off, leading to starvation. All this while year on year, we are encroaching the natural forest and human corridors in the name of agriculture. Several centuries ago, we have thousands of elephants, and we did live in harmony, even as recent as a few decades ago. One major chance since then is that many of the elephant corridors have been severed, which has led the elephants to stray off and find alternative routes. Elephants migrate hundreds of kilometers each year, and in their first discovery phase of new routes, they come into our farmlands in search of food and drink. During the drought periods, I've personally experienced a lot of damage by monkeys to all my watery systems on the farm. The damage has simply been controlled by placing a constant source of water for the monkeys away from the crops. Since they have what they need, they don't bother me as much. Similarly, I believe the concept of an elephant corridor will be effective, and 60 hectares is a sizable land to try. However, many factors need to be taken into consideration. The corridor has to be designed such that the elephants will be trained not to affect the crops and pass through in peace. And yes, elephants are highly trainable. There are certain trees that have proven its effectiveness in deterring elephants as well, so a combination of techniques will have to be adopted. However, this isn't for the faint-hearted. It'll take time, attitude adjustment, and a whole lot of coordination. However, on the long run, I believe it will have its merits. Animal psychology is a valid science, and I believe we need to research this in depth to find an effective and sustainable solution. Sorry for the long and somewhat disorganized post. Writing isn't my strong suit. Do get in touch for further details. This is something I'm personally interested in, being a Sri Lankan myself. So I've gotten a few responses. This was probably the most useful, and the gentleman in Northern India I've reached out to, Chana, as I hear back from him, I'll pass it along and maybe just put you guys in contact directly. What I can speak about from large graziers being suitably sated by corridors is personally from North America, working with things like moose, elk, deer, bison, not so much bison, but the others. And generally, the idea of a corridor works really well by ensuring that there's a number of watering holes first and foremost. So whatever the design of your site is, and what I'd probably do in your sense is for the 60 acres, get a sense of where potentially watering points or water impoundments, either seasonal or perennial, could be. And then from there, design the corridor first, because you'll probably want to have a sense of where the animals are initially coming from. So you're not trying to necessarily herd them into a place and then designing the farm around it, if that's your focus. The second is, I have found that feeding wild animals close to farm or vegetated land generally just gives them a pathway into where I've got production mentality. That said, and this is one of the things that I've reached out back to Asham, they were talking about some different trees that have been effective against elephants. And so I'll just kind of give you my broad sense of how I'm approaching this, because again, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form in this, but I do have experience in regenerative land design. First, I want to get a number of case studies and understandings about how this is done. I want to start to create a plant palette. So what are the plants that might be deterrents? What are plants that we know that the elephants are grazing upon? What are their needs generally? So going back to first principles in terms of a needs and yields conversation from permaculture and inherent characteristics. So what are elephants inherently needing? What do they produce? Because they do produce some aspect within their biological functionality. What could then be used from that use? So is there a way to harmonize with them? And then from there, starting with a regenerative design with those animals in mind, because I would consider them to be the threat overall to the landscape. If we did a SWOT analysis on your entire farm, the largest threat would be large graziers that can basically knock down fences, potentially injure guards, and be a huge amount of financial drain. So what would then be the result of that otherwise? I wonder if there's novel solutions like webcams that are used to potentially support the wildlife corridor that are pay-per-view, something in that innovative realm that helps people to get closer to these animals from a distance, and help to support. A lot of the cause-based marketing we've done with sites has been around access to animals. So how can people be in the center of that habitat and that interactivity? But yeah, that's what I've got this far. I don't know if anybody else has had experience working with elephants and wants to chime in, but that's where I'm at currently, China. And I just have to say, hats off to you for wanting to work with this and be a part of the solution for the ecology instead of leaning on what I think a lot of your country's population is doing. And I understand it. They're trying to produce a fair bit of food and conversation. What are the historic predators for elephants in Sri Lanka, and are they currently there?
Well, they say bees work, but I've tried it so many times here when bees don't work. Probably it's because of the size of the bees as opposed to what you find in Africa, which is supposed to be like larger. So I tried raising bees, but it didn't work. But I'm sure thorny sort of plants may deter elephants. It's just to get them sort of, growing for 1.5 to 2 years until they reach a sizable sort of, size actually. It's very difficult because these guys are so brainy, they're so intelligent. I mean, I've used PIR detectors with audible alarms. Worked for about 2 weeks. That's about it. They just came and, destroyed everything. Yeah.
Right. And then are elephants indigenous to Sri Lanka, or did they migrate over or brought over, or?
No, they're indigenous.
Indigenous. Okay. Right. And then what are the stories or the history of coexisting with elephants in your country's past?
I think this is the issue because my farm is in the middle of about 15,000 acres of say 7,000, 6,000 hectares of farmland, which are farmed conventionally. And all of these people use guns and crackers.
Right.
Whereas previously they used to sort of, leave aside at least 10, 15% of their collectively. So that made a lot of sense. That's what I'm worried about. If I leave 10%, would that be a safe haven for these guys to sort of, come to my farm?
Okay. Yeah, I know of some of the corridors that are created in North America. The Y comes to the Yukon to the Yellowstone comes to mind, and others that have been done in Kenya as well. It's really about feeding and making sure all of the elephants, or in those situations, it's not elephants, but all of the animals' needs are situated within that corridor, but it's also connecting that corridor outside of the farm. So that way it's not just, an isolated conversation. It's a much bigger conversation in that situation, but yeah, it's a great design problem to chew on. And as I said, as I get information back, and if other people are starting to post on there, I'll definitely pass it along to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and again, thank you for what you're doing. I just think it's phenomenal.
Cheers.
Okay, awesome. Let's jump back in. We've got a great question from Erica. And Erica, in all the time I've been teaching, no one's ever asked me this question, which seems bizarre because it's a great question. And you'll all hear about it during final design submission. So starting off from Erica, you've seen so many designs, you've made many yourself, you've implemented them too, you've watched many people start their designing journey. I wonder, have you seen any patterns and mistakes that beginners make? Are there any common mistakes, or can't it be generalized? Are there mistakes different depending on the size of the site, or perhaps relating to what climate we're in, or related to age or of designer or client, perhaps? That last one is fun, and I might get into that, although it might take 4 hours for me to totally explain it. So let's start off right from the beginning. So generally, people in our epoch of humanity want it now, they want it yesterday, they want it cheap, they want it quick, and they want it high quality. And generally, folks don't want to take the time for deep observation and prolonged and protracted thought. So generally, I see designers make mistakes by not observing the site and not really getting a sense of what is the biological natural blueprint as it exists today. And that's kind of a loaded statement, because what's native is always changing from geological epoch to epoch to epoch. In places where I was designing temperate rainforests, there was once tropical rainforest. And so it changes over time. But understanding what that is in that situation is really important. And I had a student from these classes, from Oregon State University pro classes, and I get usually 4 to 5 every year that want to be mentored personally. And this gentleman had taken the course, he'd gone through the work, he was designing out of Ontario. He knew to take a look at what's the bioregion, what's the ecoregion, what's the native plant flora and fauna that wants to be there, and then augmenting off of that. Because if we understand that there's ribes, or there's vaccinium, or there's the types of families, and they may be native, non-edible, we know the families will grow there, then we know inherently that the cultivated varieties will grow there as well. And that's probably one of the biggest mistakes I see, is people just don't take that big picture conversation. And one of the great things about this course is that it really forces you to take a serious look at ecology and a serious look at what is pre-existing. So that pre-existing biome blueprint is so exceptionally important. And if you're going to be in your area forever, it's one of the most important things you can do. What is the biome I live in? What are the animals that are around me? What's the vegetation around me? What is the geology underneath my feet? What are generally the soils I'm going to encounter? Are there any rare soils, things like dispersive soils? Are there any major problems in my area? And by becoming that level of specialist, you can avoid another major issue of permaculture, is some people remain generalists for years. And it's not necessarily a problem, but if you're a generalist throughout your entire permaculture career, it means you never really attracted or attached to a certain element. I like broad scale water. I like helping people into business. I like dealing with people's frustrations when they're dealing with their own personal trauma and trying to put in a business or a design or whatever. Those are places where I'm uniquely suited. That's my essence coming through. And a lot of permaculture designers and a lot of new graduates will try to be somebody else. They'll try to be Jeff Lawton, they'll try to be Rosemary Morrow, they'll try to be Marisha Arbuck or Andrew or me. And you're missing the point of being able to incorporate this design approach that's so much about who you are and what your context is and what your internal context is, and applying it in a way that works. And this brings up the second point, which is the forced functioning aspect of permaculture is probably my least favorite aspect of it. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a lowercase p permaculturalist. It's a tool in my toolbox. It's not everything. This forced functioning of like, oh, I saw it in a permaculture so-and-so, so I'm going to plop it into a landscape and not think about what the function of that tool is. So swales are ditches on contour with uncompacted mounds that are specifically used to grow forest systems. And yet that definition gets lost on a lot of first-time designers, and you see swales all over the place, and they're not growing forest, and they're not there to sink water, and it doesn't make a lot of sense of why they're there. But it was created in a wet, dry, or a dry tropic situation to grab that water, not allow it to flow over land, and sink it into the ground. That's what it was used for. And when you see sort of the panaceas of permaculture, the swale or the herb spiral, which I will denigrate at length in a moment, it becomes problematic because people become so emblematic of that thing, and we must have that thing. So when The Biggest Little Farm came out, it was a documentary about a documentary filmmaker and I think she was like a nutritionist or a chef or something. They decided to buy a piece of land And they got an angel investor. It's one of those things they kind of skip over a little bit, or they say very quickly in the documentary. And people get so excited about that, not realizing that they didn't get $5 million, that the terms of which the payback were sketchy at best. And I think a good portion of it was forgiven. Takes a lot of time and effort to make any sort of vegetative ecosystem. Doesn't matter what you're doing or how you're going about it. There's no quick push and pull and get a result in any of this, because we're always working with ecological systems. But the other side of that is, and Masanobu Fukuoka said this best, is that the art of cultivation isn't perfecting the land. The art of cultivation is to perfect the person, is to come back to the ecology that grew us and evolved us and created us as we are today, and not the fact that we've become de-evolved outside of being interactive with our ecology, which a lot of people think that we should be considered a subspecies. Taxonomists believe we should become a subspecies of humanity, which is Homo sapien domesticus fragilis, because we literally can't live without technology anymore, which really belies the experience of being connected with our ecology and not force functioning things like herb spirals. My issue with herb spirals is they dry out too quick. They're hard to water. And yes, you do get whatever the length of the row is and you get it spiraled up and all the rest of it, but they're also hard to manage because you're bending over. And for those of us that have low back and the lumbar issue, leaning over a big bed is not a great thing. So I've never enjoyed people loving the herb spiral and just plopping it into a design without any thought. And I think that kind of brings us into the idea that I'm just going to grab things off the permaculture shelf, put them onto the landscape, and they'll do fine. When we take a look at water access structure, which was Bill Mollison's approach, and then Jeff Lawton really supported it, and thus we have it all over permaculture. You have to plant the water first, as Brad Lancaster says. You have to understand where the water is going to be, because where the water is going to be is where you have an opportunity to plant. And where you can plant, there might be an opportunity for production in some way, shape, or form, either ecological production or human production. And the approach of that conversation means you have to be conscientious about the client, the intrinsic characteristic of the landscape, the regulations. This is the other thing that permaculturists don't do very well, especially from the Lawton lineage. And there's a famous example of a freshly minted Lawton permaculturist coming back to Canada and just putting in ponds everywhere, and then receiving cease and desist orders from the local regulatory board, and then the client being left holding the bag to finish it, to figure it out, to get the permitting for it, all the rest of it. So generally, there's not enough conversation within the permaculture world about regulations and the regulatory environment you live in, and being at least knowledgeable about it, so that way you know if you're going to transgress against it, and at best knowledgeable, because that's the fight you want to fight. Because there are some fights worth fighting, but if anyone's ever gone up against some of the due diligent regulatory boards that we have, sometimes sepulture, civil courage, and just doing it because you think it's important and fighting the fight is the way to go. And sometimes just not transgressing against that. One of the main objectives of the Water Sustainability Act in British Columbia, and many water sustainability acts the world over, is to make sure that a water impoundment doesn't negatively impact flow or people downstream. And this all came about because in the 80s, I think it was 83, 84, there was a dam that failed and washed out somebody's house. And it wasn't the people who had the dam's house, it was a neighbor. And so all of this is about due diligence and making sure the circle of care is there. And that's why there's such a thing called live load above grade and dead load below grade. And there's different categories of these. So it's important to understand those. There's a lot of permaculture folks, or there's a lot of people who get into permaculture design or regenerative design who design in a way that doesn't work with how they think. So you have to also understand that you think in a certain way, and some of us can learn different ways of thinking and some of us can't. So when I started, I was very spatially aware. I could think in 3D and I could think in 2D and I could think in renders. Some people can't. Some people can only see it to believe it. And so they have to make models, either physical or digital. And so that, in kind of some ways, constraints are great in permaculture, be it how you're going to design or the design itself, because it just limits options. So I had these students in kind of year 6, 7, I was teaching, and they could not visualize 3 dimensions. through 2D and plan view. It just wasn't possible. And when I showed them Google SketchUp, they're like, we get this. This is, yeah, we can do this. And then instead of trying to force function them to understand base plans and all the rest of it, they designed in 3D, they designed the irrigation, the mulch, they designed everything in SketchUp. And then there's an application in SketchUp called Layout, which then takes everything three-dimensional and puts it into plan views and gives bill of quantities and cut orders and all that. So being conscientious of how you design and not making yourself wrong, because that can happen as well in this work. If you take a look at a cross section, you're like, it's just total confusion to me, and always thinking, well, if I don't learn how to cross section, I'm not going to be a good designer. That's garbage. It's always about finding where it is you want to play and how you want to play. I worked with a good friend and colleague of mine, Lila Darwish, who wrote Earth Repair, all about phyto and micro remediation, how we can clean up things like heavy metals and sometimes of toxin through plants and vegetation and fungi and microbes. And her big thing was she hated base maps. She hated making maps. She hated reading them. And we were having coffee in Victoria one day, and I was just like, why don't you guild with somebody, work with somebody, collaborate with somebody who's better at base maps and just loves doing them? And it just gave her permission to be the person she was. So one of the wonderful opportunities in permaculture is to really be specific about who you are and how you go out into the world in ecology. There's that old saying, if you're a hammer, you go out into the world, and if you only focus on your ability to be a hammer, all you'll see is nails, which can be a problem. But the reverse of that is as important to know, which is, as a hammer, go seek out nails. Go seek out the things that you are innately gifted to go and solve. And that becomes as important as learning the new skill that we're trying to show you. Over planning, under planning. So one of the things that I learned probably in year 2 is that I was trying to be everything to everyone in every single design. And it was such a problem. I was trying to give them 7 layers of food forest. I was trying to give them bees and composting and some kind of water feature and some kind of annual. And it was way too much for every single site. Every site is so specific. So I really focus on what's the 1 or 2 things that is going to move the needle most for design. And sometimes my implementation or my suggestion is 1, 2, 3 things max. As I work with clients now, as I work with, property owners, homesteaders, and farmers, I give them a limit. It's 1 new experiment a year. You can't put more than 1 new thing in a year. And this comes from Darren Doherty of the Agrarians platform. Let's make farming boring again. Let's just do 1 thing new, not 7 things new. So it's the same thing on small scale. Just do 1 thing. If people don't know how to do it, it's 1 thing. And once you have, semi-mastery, because we can get to decent levels of understanding quite shortly. It feels like everyone can get to 80% pretty quickly, and then they'll spend the next 80 years getting the other 20. But just 1 new thing, 1 new experiment. And I always focus on subtraction over addition. So as I take a look at a site, what can we remove from the site in terms of obligation or physical structures or physical vegetation? What can we remove? And if we do remove, what's the application in that space? I've gone into many an argument with the native conservationist folks about the Garry Oak ecosystem on Vancouver Island. The main reason being is that this was an ecosystem that was specific to the Coast Salish people of that area and needed fire, anthropogenic fire. People were putting fire on the landscape. Did I mention there was fire there? And most of the conservationists want to forget that that's the case. And then they get upset when they design and build these Garry Oak ecosystems, these meadows that take tens, if not, 50 to 60 years to create. And then they make their asphalt pathways that go through the ecosystem, and they're upset when their asphalt pathways create a little microclimate of warmth that then allow for things like Scotch broom to bloom beside it. And then they get all frustrated by it. It's like, well, you've created an ecosystem that doesn't have its social component, doesn't have its anthropogenic component. And then you get mad when the genetic seed bank that there is trying to express itself. So just be conscientious about when you're going to design, what can we subtract first and foremost? Zones is one of the unique aspects that permaculture gives to the world. And it's amazing how many people ignore it. People, instead of going, okay, we're going to keep things that we see daily in zone 1, they make an island of zone 1 that's like a good 30, 40 feet away from the house. it gets completely neglected. It gets overgrown. The system fails, shock of shockers. So it's really about when you have things that are necessary to have human friction beside. This is from a good friend of mine, Gord Baird of eco-sense.ca. He talks about how much does the human need to bump up against the system? How much friction does it need from the human? You put that close to where the humans walk and move. Larry Santoyo has a great argument about how the lettuce garden should go right beside the pathway from the front door to the car in urban-based culture, because you want to see it every day and cut as you come home. So it's really about making those things local and not trying to force function again a zone 1 element into a zone 5 and then say, oh, well, we'll just go walk and see it. I can't tell you how many gardens, how many animals, how many systems have failed or severely been impacted from that one statement of, well, we'll just walk and see it. You won't. 100% you won't do it. Same thing with watering. Oh, I'll just hand water it. That statement is usually from somebody who's never hand watered before, almost 90% of the time. The other 10%, they're like, you see them, they're big, they're burly, male, female, doesn't matter. They're just, they know what to do. They know how to get in there. They know, and that's fine if that's who you are as a person. But the majority of people, this is Javin raising his hand, is not good at maintenance watering and needs to put in irrigation timing and needs to put in irrigators. That will work. So just making sure that you're clear that the zones make sense. Another great, I didn't know Darren was going to come up so much in this, but it really shows how much of his education has impacted me. He has this great saying, before you're green, you have to be blue and black. And again, going back to Brad Lancaster, plant the water first, worry about making good soil, worry about good soil prep, and then worry about the plant. So this is the, if I have to cut down a tree and I only have an hour, I'll take 50 minutes to sharpen the axe and 10 to cut it down. We really want to be focused on good soil and good soil prep. So it's always water access structure. I'm adding water soil access structure in this conversation. And again, if you're keen and you want a good tool for broad acre landscapes, the Agrarian's platform of climate, geography, water access, all of that goodness. And their handbook is fantastic for that. It's unfinished. It's like, I think it's like 2/3 finished. He's got another third to go. If he wasn't so popular and so good at what he did, it would be done earlier because it keeps getting jobs. Okay, access and maintenance. I've already commented on some of this to some of the designs I'm seeing thus far from the other course, because you guys are just getting to your design. If you cannot access it, you cannot maintain it. If you cannot maintain it, it will not thrive. So generally, folks plant way too close at the beginning. They don't have what's called a canopy respect. Basically, I don't know where I picked up this, but basically I take 25% of the diameter of the tree, and that becomes the minimum distance between that canopy and another canopy of a relative size. So if our canopy is 10 feet, then usually I'm leaving 2.5 feet at mature canopy between the two mature canopies. It might mean that the stems themselves look very far out for a long time, but that then leaves us open to what's called support planting. So this means we have a lot of herbaceous cover, a lot of nitrogen fixation cover, a lot of pollinator. This is where I think systems like syntropic agroforestry give us a lot of innovation and a lot of technique, in that you start with your main species potentially planted in year 1 to year 3, but you're really focused on annual. You're focused on that successional model where you're focused on pioneers at the beginning. Scatter pattern for plant design. Almost all of you are going to transgress on this, at least in your first design. I want a couple of lavender over here and a hollyhock over there and maybe a mango over there. It's like, oh my goodness. If you ever have to maintain something, this is a lot of disparity within a landscape. And it also usually shows up in a lack of an aesthetic cohesion. So I am a production designer. I like to have sections that are for production and they're to produce food. And I don't mind having other sections that are pseudo, where we're having a little bit of production, but generally we're not focusing on pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare. We're focused on a bit of beauty, a bit of habitat creation. This is this whole thing of when you sit, you stand, your stand, don't waddle, just focus on whatever it is you're doing. And a bit of the myth of permaculture is that you can have an entire forest of food and it will produce at the same levels or higher as conventional. I have not seen that once, but the resiliency of a system that has multiple different types of production from perennial to annual will outperform by a caloric basis on small holdings this conversation. Generally, when we're moving into production systems at scale, we're moving to agroforestry, we're moving into silvopasture, we're moving into syntropic agroforestry, sometimes natural farming or sequence farming, but we kind of move beyond. It's very hard to get major production off of a permaculture food forest at scale, kind of post the 5-6 acre. I've seen 5 acres at permaculture scale produce quite a bit, managed by one person, works pretty well. At 10 acres, it kind of falls apart because at that point, there's a labor requirement, there's a literacy component, and you can't impart the wisdom of your beautiful artistic sketch of a food forest to other people. It's very hard to do for them to manage and maintain it, usually within the high turnover that comes with agricultural systems. So just be conscientious that when you are designing, pollinating aspects or mulch makers or anything like that, sure, play with the form and the function to make sure it looks aesthetically beautiful to you. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But once you get down to production, be conscientious that if you don't focus on, okay, I see a line of carrots and I see a line of kale and I see a round keyhole bed of kale, that it will be difficult to be like, where do we put another kale? Was it behind the currents? And it happens all the time. There's just so much planting. It's hard to actually manage it. So many people don't design for beauty. And we've got a course right now that's operating called Aesthetic Design for Ecological Landscapes with Jamie Wallace, who's an instructor in this course, who started ornamental and then moved regenerative and ecological. And it is phenomenal. And this has been my experience as well. Beautiful designs get tended to. Even if there's beautiful designs that are like some pollinator plantings that are specifically around a portal that comes into it, which is an entranceway, they get tended to. Beautiful designs, beautiful landscapes get tended to. And beautiful designs always have a market. Always. Doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing, there's always a market. Farmscape landscapes do have appeal, but if they're not beautiful, they become sort of prison camps of work. So you also have to be conscientious that the designs you make are beautiful and inviting to the senses, inviting to the eyes. It's one of the reasons why Ribes odoratum has been on my plant palette for years, because it's a beautiful currant, orange on the bush, is ripe on the bush for up to a month, and smells like clove and cinnamon. And so if I'm coming into a doorway, it's there in temperate climates. And similarly, as you move into other climates, you find the plants you love. Lack of mulch. There are some places in the world when you get into the tropics where mulch becomes problematic because of the habitat it creates for poisonous and dangerous insects and reptiles and sometimes amphibians. But generally in our temperate climes, there's usually a massive lack of mulch. And that lack of mulch creates issues of oxidization for a lot of primary elements we need to keep in the soil. It also creates issues for lack of water retention, and thus creates issues for creating a very diverse soil food web that's underneath the soil. So I see that quite a bit. That's kind of the design mistakes. There's 2 major mistakes about just people who've taken permaculture. I'll just say this because it's fun. You don't know better than a farmer. If you've taken a PDC and you think you do, leave permaculture alone and leave agriculture alone for a while. Come back later. This idea that you can come through a PDC and walk away and then know more than somebody who spent time and experience understanding their land, fair enough from a conventional perspective, is really problematic, not only for the movement and the operation of the system in general, but also just your ability to react and translate and interact with people. So luckily, I had somebody who was a farmer for years who taught in my course and told me this. So I didn't go out trying to tell farmers that I knew better than them, having never farmed before. I built my farming experience and food production experience and my soil experience all by experience. And I guess I would add this in there as well. It's like an online course is a great place to start because it's very difficult to get this amount of information into a PDC and not feel like you were just run over by a carnival parade. when I was teaching the immersive PDCs, there's just so much information. It's impossible. You're drinking from a fire hose. It's too much. What I love about this format is we get a little bit, you get to go back to your life, you get to think about it, you get to apply it as you want with some of the assignments. But the problem is that you need real life experience. And as Richard Walker, who was a mentor of mine, who created an amazing food forest called Dragon's Eye Nursery, the best thing you can do after a food forestry course is take a stick, dig a hole and plant a tree and observe. Really understand what you're seeing, what you're looking at, understand what roots are, understand what the crown is, all these things that we can talk about and are fun to talk about, and your mind hears them, but your hands haven't felt them and your muscles don't get them. And we want to go so far as to say your spirit isn't relating to them. So really, post an online PDC, take as much practical experience as you can. Know that gardener is Latin for plant killer. Not true, but a fun joke. So you're going to take time and experience. You're going to kill a lot of plants. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. But as Sepp likes to say, the book of nature is always open when we read it wrong, not if we read it wrong. So we can always go back and learn again. Last but not least, for those of you that are thinking about business, you're not thinking about your reputation, your business systems, your process, but you think, I'm going to be a permaculturalist and permaculture designers, don't bother. I almost got kicked out of a natural building colloquium. These are people who build with clay, sand, stone, straw. Because I said this at the beginning and I told the organizers, this is going to be my message, because I've worked with a lot of natural builders, helping them design their business. And so many of them are like, well, people are just going to find out about me. Folks, most nobody knows what natural building is. And it's kind of hard to make a resurgence when modern materials are so prevalent. So yeah, you need to start to be thinking about that. So anyways, Erica, how'd I do? Too much, too little?
No, very well. I think it's very interesting because I've done 2 PDCs before, and then I've been working in my garden, and I believe that I have made quite a few mistakes, mainly relating to not being able to calculate how much time things takes, and also I haven't done any herb spirals because I didn't buy into that. Is that good? No, never mind. I'm just kidding. Well, I think it's been. I sometimes think that we, many of us, we have been very anxious and worried about the environment for a long time, and then we learn about permaculture and we feel like, oh, this is so good. And at least for me, I was quite eager. And when I had learned about this, like the basic designs, and I understood things, and then I also discovered that, oh, I still haven't harvested very many carrots because I don't know how to grow things, because there are so many things that you also need to learn. And for example, in areas of the world where people still live at the country and they grow their food, it's a different thing. But for me, it's like I had to start all over with so many things. And I didn't really think about that from the beginning.
Yeah.
But that's the place for the bushes, and that's the place for the plants, and this and that, and everything has to be tended to. And that's something you have to learn. I think I've just learned how to prune my grapes properly after 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. There's so much to learn, especially from a food perspective, when you are inherently a disowned population from food production. And I think most of us are. If we've grown up in Western civilization, we've definitely missed the boat, or grown up in the city. So it takes a long time to develop each of those skills. And so my approach has always been, one new skill, one new plant a year. I'm just learning one. I'm not learning 12. I'm just learning one, because my initial teacher, and then became really good friend, colleague, and is now a very good friend, Brandon Bauer, his approach to this was, he was despondent with university in Cleveland, Ohio, dropped out, went out to Orcas Island on the west coast of America, was homeless and had very few dollars to his name, and then started to garden so he could feed himself in public spaces. He had all these secret gardens that he was trying to understand. And so he could save up enough money to take the Bullock Brothers PDC. Crazy. And so he dedicated himself solely to understanding plants, to understanding their Latin names, to understanding their development, to understanding soils. And it's all he did, to the detriment of, I would say, his health at that time. So for the rest of us that want to do it in a bit more balanced way, so that way we can learn and also design and develop our own lives at the same time, you kind of have to take a simple approach. And mine has been, I just learn one new plant a year. And that's how I worked for a number of years until I could then learn 2 and 3 and 4, because I had basically a system and a process, and I also had some skill base. So I appreciate what you were saying. Thank you. Erica, your question there in terms of the aesthetic design, I've placed the link in the chat. The course is in process. I think it finishes, I think tonight is our 5th session, next week's our 6th, and then it'll be available as a self-paced course. So if you're not on the All Points Design or the mailing list there, definitely do sign up if you want to be known when that goes to the self-paced version. Awesome. Great. Where are we at? 10 minutes to go and 2 questions. Pretty good. Okay. Question from Ruben in the sunny Okanagan. Could you talk a little bit about the ecological function called in the plant ID sheet of our microclimate work? So yeah, let's talk about that. And I did have this up. Great. So when we take a look at microclimates, what we're trying to do is get a sense of what are the plants currently within your different microclimates to start to kind of push you towards the idea that plants will become brilliant and beautiful and thrive in certain microclimates and less so in others. So in here, we have the ability to put in whatever that plant might be. What's the form, the habitat, the function, etc. I'll zoom in here. There we go. What's the microclimate? And then we have these 2 columns. One is called human use and one's called ecological function. So years ago, David Holmgren, the co-creator of Permaculture, came to Lost Valley Eco Village and walked through with Rick Valley, who's an amazing living repository of knowledge about many things, bamboo included. And David had never been in a temperate climate before, like the Oregon Pacific Northwest, the rainforest there. And so what he did is he walked through with Rick, and David decoded the landscape from purely looking at the plant shape, where it was, the shape of the flower, even going in closer and seeing stamens, because he had studied so much about ecology that he could make assumptions or deductions based upon the stamen and the way the stamen was shaped and all the rest of it in the pistil. And so that allowed him to decode this landscape and go, I'm seeing this plant in this place and I'm seeing it over here. Does it serve this ecological function within this ecosystem? Is it, primarily pollination and primarily a pioneer in the way that it is and how it operates? And from the story that I heard about this, because a buddy of mine was behind them filming it, he basically decoded 80% of the landscape by purely reading the landscape as is. And David actually just put out an amazing film that is either now directly out for free or is about to be, called Reading the Landscape, with my late colleague, Dan Palmer. So the ecological function is really trying to understand what role does this plant play in the ecology, to the plants, to the animals, and sometimes even to the small scale weather systems. So one thing we know is that trees on the underside of leaves, their stoma will release organic particulate, and those organic particulate will become the nuclei of rain clouds, further either up or down slope, depending on the geography of the site. So similarly here, what we're trying to understand is what and how do the other elements of ecology interact with this plant in this section. So this takes a little bit of research. The Natural Capital Plant database is really good for this, as is Plants for the Future. They do a really good job on ecological functionality. So if you're looking at assignment 17, on the left-hand side, we've got a full list here of all of these great plant lists and database that are great to take a look at. So I would suggest looking there if you're wanting to research some of the ecological functionality. Does that answer your question there, Ruben?
Yeah, so I I think I've done a pretty good job of figuring out like like it makes sense to me how, for example, animals use the various parts. But I'm not finding resources that help me understand like what the grass means to the tree. So in my landscape, they're calling it a woodland, that the climax is a ponderosa pine with a bunch grass in between the pines. And that's for large parts of it, that's essentially all you see. And so it's like, so the grass obviously does things like it holds soil, you know, it has its own functions of harvesting water, and you know, it's a living thing doing what living things do, which is fill niches. But trying to figure out like what does that grass mean to the tree
Yeah.
is a part that I haven't like been able to figure out.
Yeah. So once you take a look at climax ecological assemblage, or if you're looking at successional assemblage and how the parts interact with it, some of that is reading between the lines. So, you know, generally when you're taking a look at landscape, especially in sort of dry, arid plateau with humid glaciated geology, you're going to find a lot of those trees in crevices or in small indentations because there's actually a bit of water there. And then you're going to see that grass kind of coming up to and dissipating towards the tree, because generally most trees produce allelopathic exudates through the roots for grass, because they compete generally. So a lot of the savanna plantings you'll see a dissipation of grass as it gets closer to the trees. And the trees, of course, support that by dropping their leaves and trying to smother the grass, or by acidifying the soil with needles and then making it harder for grass to grow. So some of that is your interpretation of it, because this type of way of looking at ecology is not native to the Western scientific mind. It's very native to the indigenous populations of South America, where so many of even the indigenous names have to work with the relationship between, like there's the Shuar people in the Amazon of Ecuador. They have a lot of their vocabulary around this tree is relationship to this plant, because when you talk about the plant, the word of it is of this tree and the way that it interacts with the tree and where you find it. So some of that's observational, and a lot of it, the academic Western mind has skipped over that, even though in quadrats, it's like, we find this plant with this plant, but they make no connection about it. There's no conversation. So a lot of that, from the level you're talking about, sort of assemblage at climax or at the different successional stages, is going to be you reading between the lines and musing and having observations outside of just what the plant does and you know, those conversations, but between species. Great question. Yeah. I'm loving you guys' questions. These are great. Second questions. I'm working ahead, so I have some slack for a site visit. Regarding upcoming water flows, I saw one of your past class videos where you talked about permeabilities. The different amounts of water that flow from different surfaces. Metal roofs were 90%, but some soils were down to 0.05%. Based on the lack of gulches, ditches, and ravines, I think my site is far more the latter, with rainfall falls and almost all of it is absorbed. Can you give some guidance on how to talk about water flows in a site where little water flows? Yeah, totally. So what Ruben's talking about, because we're not quite there yet, is we're talking about what's called runoff coefficients. So every substance has a level of water it will absorb, and then water that will run off of it. So if we think of it this way, if 100 liters of water falls on a certain surface, a certain number of liters will leave that in a form of percentage. And if you go forward to the water survey and take a look at the water coefficient chart I put together, you'll see them all spelled out. So in places that are, one, highly glaciated, like the Okanagan, and then the Boundary, which is just east of that where I used to live, it's a very permeable soil. It's very glaciated. It's got a lot of till soil to it. And so it's very permeable. So at this point, we have to talk a little bit about field capacity and saturation, because I don't think it's actually in the course currently. So field capacity and saturation are two states of being for hydrology that is important for us to understand, so we can talk about this. So I'm going to take one step back to take a few steps forward. So if we take a look at a soil PED, and a soil PED is basically just a clump of soil. We can call it like a soil molecule. So there'll be sand, there'll be silt, there'll be clay in here, there'll be some organics. What happens is when we water some kind of soil, what'll happen is that water works on these two principles called adhesion and cohesion. Adhesion and cohesion. adhesion, the ability for water to add itself to something else. So if you're ever pouring a glass of something and it kind of dribbles down the backside of the glass, that's adhesion at work. And cohesion, the ability to water to attach to itself. So adhesion and cohesion. Together, we call these capillary action. This is why when you spill a little bit of red wine on your shirt, it goes three-dimensionally and resists gravity. So one of the interesting things about capillary action is it resists gravity, which is why swales work. Because when water fills up that uncompacted, the ditch in front of or behind the uncompacted mound, that three-dimensional wetting pattern actually moves through that soil depending on its permeability. So when we're watering, we're usually trying to hit and stay at field capacity generally for most of our species. Now, the problem is that if we get too much water in here, we start to fill up all of the space in between. Now, before the space is filled in, well, it's called the same either. It's called interstitial airspace. So the air in between the little tiny PEDs and the little tiny elements of the soil is airspace. Why is that useful for soil? This is not rhetorical. I want to see if anybody gets this. The agrologist can't answer. Wands, I see you. So why is interstitial airspace important? Why is air important in soil?
I would assume that plants need, they don't need oxygen.
The microorganisms.
The microorganisms, you got it. Yes. So the microorganisms need oxygen. They're terrestrial. Our soils need to be terrestrial. This is why we don't put hugelkultur on contour. Hugelkultur is made to hold and store water. And if we have water that's held and stored above it, it will turn into an aquatic environment. So we want to keep, from a first principles perspective, we want to keep our soils at field capacity. But if there's more water that comes in, it moves from field capacity into saturation. Saturation is the point in which we start to get overland runoff or overland pooling. So basically, the soil has to get to saturation, and at that point, then we start to see water on top. Usually, there's some exceptions. There's some hydrophobic soils, there's some exudates that can be produced in soils. There is some exceptions, but for the most part, for your question, getting this idea of field capacity to saturation is important, because what we want to get a sense of, and I'm sure, Ruben, if we decide to do a QGS output, and I know you being the man you are, you could probably do it and figure it out to get all of the different water flows and what's called the TWI, which is a total wetness indicator to show where the water moves, is that over time, if you start to transition your soils from being generally devoid of life, low carbon, low bacterial to fungal ratio, and you slowly move them through addition of organic matter, aerated compost extracts and teas, starting to work with some of those fish scale swales, which I think, or fish scale mulches, which I think would work really well in your environment, because your environment is the same as Neil's, because he's still in the Okanagan, he's just in Nevada, and it's that same type of ecology going all the way up. Over time, what you'll find is that the soil will actually start to hold on to more moisture and will actually get to field capacity a little bit quicker. And so you'll actually get a bit more overland flow, plus you'll actually get a little bit more infiltration over the time. So in terms of, this question, where the site of water flows, what I would be focused on is getting a sense about where water will flow during some of those few flash June soon floods that can happen in your area. Being conscientious that you'll have maybe 1 or 2 times a year or 1 or 2 times every few years to capture and store that. So being ready for that in things like ephemeral dams. If you don't have the time or energy to actually do a full dam, things like leaky weirs or jackfall, where you're taking logs and you're just putting them in drainages. So that way there is a stoppage of soil in solution flowing down, and so it can start to back up and you start to get these little water repositories. If you want more information on that, Mark Shepard in Restoration Ecology and now Water for Any Farm through Acres Publishing has done a really good job of showcasing ephemeral ponds. Some of his other work is problematic, but when you take a look at the site, it's hard to say that we can negatively comment about anyone, but there are some things that specifically he's done that move against what PA lined out in Keyline Design, which is his primary system. And he likes to say that he improved upon it. And in some ways he did, and in some ways he kind of forgot some of the main principles. So just read everything with a grain of salt. And then PA also wrote another book, right, the initial book called Water for Every Farm. And I might be screwing that up. One of them is every, one of them is any, but Water for Every Farm, Water for Any Farm. I think PA was any and Shepherd was every. And then he just put out a technical manual that I didn't know was out. I think I just got an email from Acres, which is the how-to. I think the first one is more like philosophy and design principles and practice. And then the second one is the builder's guide. So that's what I would do on your site. I'd be very conscientious about where the water is flowing, where you might be able to implement some things that take half a day, the fish scale mulch aspects. I would definitely take a look in some of those drainages for low-tech erosion control guides, things of that nature. And then leaky weirs, I think would be useful. And then wherever it is that you're going to be doing annual production or perennial, really focus on prepping that soil well at the beginning, thinking about how do I increase the organic matter and how generally do I increase it in a way that will support the trees long-term. That's a really good question. Follow-up, how's that sound for an answer?
That sounds good. Yeah, I have like a million questions about the sort of succession, the planning of building the soil. In this, it's extremely arid, very low organic matter. And so trying to think about what I could expect without irrigation and what I should think about, minimal irrigation, what I should use heavy irrigation, trying to think about different uses from grazing to pasturing to like lands to croplands.
Yep.
So yeah, my mind is stuffed full of questions on this balance of lack of organic matter and lack of ready water, like things that need water that needs to be pumped. So
yeah, if I was in your situation in your area, I would focus on the area directly around the house and the few areas we've pointed out already that look like water flows through them or could be stopped in them. And I would use those as sort of the coral reef nuclei and then work out from there successionally as you've proven a little nucleus design. I had it on the list there. I didn't really say it, but small, slow experiments that prove themselves that then you can replicate over and over again really work out well. And that's somebody who's worked in the Okanagan now for close to 8 years. I still go really slow because I want to make sure we've got the hits. So anything that water is actively flowing in the Okanagan, that's where I start immediately. I think working on that cut bank or the depositional bank for the creek, taking a look at what the local willow is up and down that creek. I'd probably walk that creek, see where I can find a couple of copses of alder, willow, red osier, or dogwood, anything like that. Plan that out in a year to 2 sessions, so that way we're going to cut on this day, we're going to plant on this day. We're going to expect a failure rate of X amount and going to take our successes, and then from there, in and around the house, if the focus is long-term tree or long-term annuals. And again, I think we talked about garlic because garlic is such a brilliant income generator to help fund the rest of the conversation there. Focus on that, focus on what the rotation of that would be. If I was in your shoes, I'd be like, okay, I want to produce this many head. I want this many processes. I'm going to get this type of material and solution to get that done. And then have those rotational beds so that way you're going to be moving it here, here, here. What's that crop rotation look like going from root to leaf to nutrition, usually back to leaf and then to garlic. And then if you are thinking about doing any kind of agroforestry or coppice agroforestry or anything around silvopasture or forestry, I would probably have a test bed that's very close to the house that we can see by looking out the window. And this is really important, is seeing and understanding what that tree is doing as you're educating yourself on it, so you don't have to walk to it. And then also that can be the litmus test for the rest of the property. If you do end up putting in a couple acres of something, you always have a specimen of that tree close by. So it serves two functions. One, you can prove the model close by, and then two, you can apply it someplace further along. One is, hey, Ruben, regarding your first question, plant physiology is very important in this matter. Is the grass deep rooted? How does the root system of the trees form? When do the plants grow? Unfortunately, we live very far from each other. I'd love to come over to think together. Yeah, great implications there, Juanes, and yeah, you guys should definitely chat. You have so much experience to share, Juanes, that yeah, I'd love to even host that conversation if you were interested.
Yeah. Well, I am going in there in a couple of weeks, so I can do things like dig up a grass and take pictures of the roots and stuff like that.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah, very cool.
Awesome, folks. Well, thanks for a great hour and a bit. Yeah, brilliant. We're coming up to the break. So just as a think ahead, if you are behind currently, definitely recommend that you work ahead as much as possible, and get as much as you can under your belt. Once you get to the design assignments, they tend to get a little bit heavy, and it's enjoyable to submit early and get feedback early, so that could be useful as well. Besides that, if there's any questions or comments or queries, feel free to reach out or put them into the Zoom conversation, and we'll hit them as we do. How's everyone feeling about our time together today? What are folks taking away from the conversation thus far?
I really appreciate, as I said in the opening part, the kind of looking at it from different angles, which you did today, even like critiquing herb spirals. It's like, why? Like, why? Let's pull this apart and look at it in different ways. And that adds up to the critique.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ruben. Yeah, I've been blessed by people who have been my mentors and collaborated and contributed to my education by not making me deify or become so enamored with one thing that's the only thing I look at. So yeah, I appreciate that. We've got some good comments coming in. Juane's very glad to be back. Had some tough weeks. Sorry to hear it, brother. Glad you're here with us. From Nathan, lots of good information regarding first-time designers. I see all those mistakes I've made. We've all made them. So don't feel bad there, Nathan. We've all made those mistakes. It's comes with the territory. Anybody else want to chime in? What are you taking away from the conversation today?
Oh, I just want to say thank you, and I think it's very interesting to be here and listen to what everyone else is thinking about. And yeah, very good.
Awesome.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Erica. That's great. Callista, I love hearing your suggestions for outside reading, Javin. I will be looking into Mark Shepard and Lila Darwish's book. Yeah, great. Yeah, and I'm happy to suggest lots of conversations. Funny enough, I took trainings. Well, I didn't take training in Google Earth Pro. I just learned how to use it, and then was taught pretty extensively by Neil Bertrando, and then became quite proficient in it. And then a buddy of mine put on a course through the GIS specialist that I used, Paper Street Permaculture, Brent Smith, who's just a whiz. And I took that training and I realized I wanted somebody else to do the QGIS work for the rest of my design work. So I never went deeper into QGIS because it was too much to keep alive in my mind when I'm doing other work. And because I have such a diverse income watershed, I didn't dive into it. But I dived into a recent training that Georgi Pavlov of Regrarians did. Really liked it, but it's very specific to the Regrarians platform. So I was really, really keen when I found out that a colleague of mine, I used to teach with him years ago, Charles Williams of the Earth Activist Training and Starhawks work, put on a QGIS course. And so I just chatting with him today, and I'm going to get access to it this afternoon and probably take a look at it this week. So there'll be another thing that I can hopefully recommend to people, because I think when you're still in that permaculture phase and you haven't added any of the bigger tool sets or toolboxes, things like the agrarians is a bit too much, but a course like that and would be great for folks that want to dive into that map making conversation. So yeah, there's always, I always got more recommendations. When I used to, if you look back at the previous office hours, pre-September 1st, 2022, you'll see the books behind me. And as Darren used to joke, he's like, you haven't read those. And I'd always laugh and open one up and you'd see all of the highlights and all of the dog-eared pages and all of the Post-it notes. So I'm rather widely read. And for a while there, the publishing companies like Chelsea Green and Acorn and New Society were sending me books to review. So I got a lot of books to review and read, and I can direct you to the ones that are definitely worth your time and the others that just saying the same thing that 10 other books already said, but they needed somebody new, I guess. So yeah. Courtney, really interesting today, Javin. Thanks. Very interested in the aesthetic design Jamie Wallace course. So we'll definitely look into it. I think I'm a bit of a pick and chooser rather than one thing kind of zealot. So it's nice to hear your perspective on permaculture. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. It changed my life when I decided I had an open toolbox and an open mind, and I was working in regenerative land design because I got myself to the point where I like that word. It makes sense to me. And now I just, I do what I can with the tools I have. I don't discount anything. My next big step will be into syntropic agroforestry because I'm in a great place to practice it. But I'm taking a fair break as I've realized that diving into a new country is a huge amount of work as is. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. That was great. I really appreciated everyone's comments and queries and quotations and contributions. That was fantastic. Really looking forward to more time with this class. You guys are great. I really enjoy your contributions. And again, any questions, javin@allpointsdesign.ca. If we need any extra time, I'm happy to do that as well. One thing I will say is our final design before break is due on March 18th. And I will be marking for 1.5 days that week because on the 20th, I'm taking vacation. So if your assignments come in late, that's fine. I will mark them when I get back, but I will not be marking them after the afternoon of the 19th. So if you really wanted your grades and your feedback, definitely get them in on time that week, and then generally just work ahead. With that, it was a pleasure. Talk with you folks later. If anybody wants to say goodbye, I'll stay on for a little bit. Take care, folks.
Thank you very much, Javin.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Have a good
Bye.
week.
Thank you.